Hello, everyone, and welcome to our July 2022 community call on ROR and ORCID. So before we officially start, I just want to remind everyone of basically some of the logistics that we're kind of going through today. So one is that your microphone is currently muted right now. We will unmute it during the Q&A discussion. During the presentation, please feel free to use the chat function for questions and comments. This community call is being recorded. Slides and recording of this call will be shared to all of you via email. We will also post the link, agenda, and notes in our community discussion forum. And finally, closed captioning is enabled on this call. If needed, please click on the closed caption icon at the bottom of your Zoom window. We also would like to remind you of our community call norms. In this space, we strive to engage in respectful discussion. Please ask questions and seek clarification on our discussion. We ask that you be receptive to feedback from others. On this call and with all of our events, we follow the ORCID US Community Code of Conduct that can be found on our website under events at orcidus.lyrasis.org. So again, welcome everyone. This is our July 12, 2022 community call on ROR and ORCID, or Research Organization Registry. These are pretty much people that you probably have seen before. Of course, we have Sheila Raymond, our program leader for persistent identifiers at communities at Lyrasis. Me, ORCID US Community Specialist at Lyrasis. We also have Paloma Marín-Arraiza, Engagement Manager at ORCID, and Liz Krznarich at our ROR Technical Lead at DataSite. Liz and Paloma will talk about what is ROR, where and how does ROR fit into ORCID, what else do ORCID member organizations need to know about ROR. After that, we will open it up to a Q&A and discussion. So with that, I will pass it on to Liz to give us more information about ROR.
All right, thank you so much, Paulo, and thanks to Sheila and Lyrasis for inviting me to speak today. Very excited to be here. So as Paulo mentioned, I am going to start out just by giving an overview of ROR and a little bit of an introduction to kind of the big picture, how do ROR and ORCID and other persistent identifiers fit together, and then of course hand it over to Paloma to give you more details about ROR and ORCID together. So to start out with, what is ROR? ROR, ROR, stands for the Research Organization Registry, and that is a community-led registry of open, sustainable, usable, and unique identifiers for every research organization in the world, or we hope, as time goes on, every research organization in the world. In a practical sense, what this means is that we have a registry of organizations, which we offer in both a user interface on our website. It can also be retrieved through our API or via data dumps that we publish approximately quarterly. And we also have a search API and a search UI that allow users to find specific organizations that they might be looking for. So this all, this is all great and interesting, but why does ROR exist? Especially given that several identifier types for research organizations already existed before ROR launched, which was officially in 2019. So we had things like ISNIs, we had Ringgold IDs, we had GRID IDs. GRID has recently stopped publishing their public identifier set, so that's kind of no longer an option, although GRID IDs map to ROR. But why do we need yet another organization ID when we already have these other types? So a couple of reasons and ways that ROR is a bit different from those types is that ROR is specifically focused on research affiliations. So cases where researchers are asserting either their affiliation in terms of authorship for a research output, like a publication or a data set, or they're just asserting their affiliation maybe on an ORCID record. So that's really the focus for this, not identifying organizations for other processes. Secondly, we're really focused on connecting organizations, researchers, and research outputs via open infrastructure. So part of the big picture of ROR is helping to enable organizations to figure out what parts of the research and scholarly communication process are connected to each other in an unambiguous way. So what are the research outputs that belong to a specific organization, or what are all the organizations that a specific person is affiliated with? ROR is a bit different from some of the other IDs in that it is non-commercial. Our data set is fully open at CC0, and our API is completely public. The data dump is completely free and public as well. It's also a very community-led initiative, which leads me into the next topic. So who is ROR? Who exactly is behind ROR and who makes it run? So ROR is not an organization in and of itself. It is actually a multi-organization collaboration led by 3 different nonprofit organizations. And we have staff who are based at each of these different organizations. So Crossref, DataCite, and California Digital Library lead the Research Organization Registry initiative. And in fact, I think most of my colleagues who work at those organizations are on this call. So if any specific questions that they have expertise in come up, they can help as well. So each of these organizations contributes not only staff, but leadership and other resources per a memorandum of understanding. So ROR is not just these governing organizations, it's also the community at large, which obviously is not one specific thing. We have folks from different parts of different communities, largely academic institutions, but also publishers and funders and software developers who work in different parts of the scholarly communication process. So we have a steering group that's an advisory group made up of different community members that support strategic decision-making. We have a community advisory group that's open to basically anyone who wants to join to help give us input on upcoming projects we might be working on, to provide us feedback on what they're looking for from ROR. And finally, the way that ROR is curated, so the way that the data is actually maintained is a bit unique in that that is led by a staff member, but the decisions also go through a community curation board. So when folks submit requests to add records to ROR or update data, there's a voluntary board of people who are reviewing those requests according to some metadata guidelines that we have, and putting their time and effort into building this registry. So truly a community effort. So a little more on how ROR is curated, how data gets into the ROR registry. So back up a little bit and say that ROR was initially started with seed data from GRID. So in its earliest days, ROR contained exactly the same list of organizations as GRID, which is another organization identifier registry, the one that no longer exists that I mentioned. So our changes basically came in through GRID. In the last year, we have separated from GRID so that our curation is now completely standalone. And the way it works is that anybody can submit a request for a new record or a change to the data on a record. We have a request form. And in our documentation, which I'll share some links to at the end, we have a lot of information about how the metadata creation for records works, but anybody can use this request form to submit a request, which is reviewed again by the curation board according to curation and metadata policies that we have. And then approved changes are included in the ROR registry in the API on a rolling basis and in data dumps published quarterly. We make all the request tracking publicly available and the decisions and all the information about what's going into the registry or what didn't make it into the registry. They're all available on the ROR updates tracker. So the result at this point is that we have about 100,000 research organizations, and we really focus on specifically research organizations. By that, we mean an organization that produces or funds or facilitates, manages or publishes research, specifically that an organization that a researcher might consider themselves affiliated with, since the use case is primarily affiliations. Right now, we are focused on standalone organizations, so kind of the top level of an organization, not departments within a larger institution, although there is scope for example, research institutes that are somewhat independent from a parent institution that a researcher might consider themselves affiliated with rather than the parent organization. So finally, ROR has been in existence for about 3 years, and we have a number of organizations that have adopted ROR. You can see those on our ROR integrations page. I think there are about 50 integrations listed here with different systems. These are self-reported, so we know there are more out there. Some key integrations that exist that kind of play a role in how other integrations work are in DataCite and Crossref DOI metadata. So ROR IDs can be included in affiliation information in both of these types of DOIs, as well as in ORCID, which Paloma will tell us all about in a few minutes. So because of this integration with these services that support creating metadata, there's now growing use of ROR in systems like repositories and publishing platforms that create this sort of metadata. And that is really what we are looking toward as the real power of using these organization identifiers. So how in the real world do we use these, and what is the point of using a ROR identifier? So one use case is using ROR together with ORCID to identify affiliations. So the reason that we might want to do this is because research can be sort of viewed as a network. So we have people and places and things and relationships between them. For example, researchers work at or are affiliated with institutions. There are publications and data sets that these researchers produce. Those can also hypothetically be linked back to institutions. Funders are affiliated with researchers and institutions and also those research outputs. It can be very, very difficult to make these connections. However, unless we have metadata and information that connects these things together. So when we have that information about those connections, can make it easier for example, researchers to do things like easily submit grant applications, reports, repository deposits, and then research institutions and funders can more easily assess research impact and compliance with policies like open access policies. So from a persistent identifier perspective, the way we sort of see this working is that open persistent identifiers and their associated metadata can help to make this happen. So to expose those connections between people, places, and things involved in the research process. So where ROR identifiers play a role is identifying the institutions and potentially funders, although we also have cross-ref funder IDs for that. And ORCID IDs to identify the researchers, and DOIs to identify the outputs. Once we have those identifiers in use, we can start to insert those identifiers into the metadata for other identifiers like ORCID IDs and ROR identifiers in DOIs that allow those linkages back to people and places. And on the flip side, ROR identifiers, DOIs used in entries in ORCID records help to make those connections as well. So this is kind of the segue into Paloma's talk. What's needed to actually enable these connections that we can then use to find out what things and people and organizations are related? Well, as I mentioned, persistent identifiers work better together. We need to be using things like ORCID IDs, ROR IDs, and DOIs together. So adoption of all of these to identify people, places, and things is important, as well as high quality metadata in places like ORCID records to actually properly capture the relationships between people, places, and things. So I do have some links to resources about ROR in my slides, and there's also in the notes document a link to my slides. I don't know, Sheila and Paula, if you want to stop for questions now, or if I should just hand it off to Paloma and do questions about everything at the end.
Yeah, let's go ahead and move on to Paloma. Some people have put questions in the chat, and thank you, Amanda, for answering those in the chat. And then we can also loop back around to those at the end. And if anyone has additional questions, we can get to those at the end after Paloma.
Sounds good. All right, take it away, Paloma.
Great. Okay. Let me see if I can share my screen correctly. If not, Sheila, I think you have my presentation. If I'm unable to share, let me just check the configuration. It should work. Okay. There we are. Yes. So, are you able to see my screen? I hope. So I wanted to begin using some wording from our former executive director at ORCID. She wrote 2 years ago this article in our blog post asking what is up with ORCID and ROR. And that was an introduction of our plans in ORCID with ROR and how we were actually structuring all these move into the integration of ROR in our metadata, user interface, and API. And last year in October, our product team published at Research Institution identifiers with ROR. So at that point, the ROR ID was completely introduced in the API, and later this year, it was also added to the user interface. So let's begin with some context, also picking some of the ideas that Liz already brought to this presentation and conversation about connecting IDs, or the main goal about PIS, which is ID to ID connection. So if we have a look at the number of affiliations that we have to US organization in ORCID records, we see that we have over 2 million actually, and almost 1 million researchers if we look at those numbers. but also almost 500,000 of those affiliations entries don't contain any organization identifier. We see here the evolution, which is pretty good and clear, but is there any reason why some of those entries don't have an organization identifier and therefore don't have this ID to ID connection? So one thing is that about 98% of the total number of affiliations that we have in our ORCID records, not only from the US, but also worldwide, are entered manually by the researcher. And only about 2% are entered using the API, so via an institutional addition or an institutional integration. So what can be done with that? And this was one thought. So thinking of this 98, the main problem is that some researchers might enter a name, they won't pick one of the institutions listed in the drop-down list, maybe because they are adding a different institution name or in another language. And this leads to the situation where we have affiliations without an identifier. So we identified that as a problem, actually, and then we have steps to a possible solution, and they go through ROR as well. So first of all is the introduction of ROR in the user interface, so that when people select one of the drop down of the organization listed in the drop down list, they can pick directly the ROR ID because it's the default ID at the moment. And the other part is the normalization of identifiers, so of organization IDs, so that if we have an affiliation that is added through Ringgold, through FundRev, and through ROR, that we have all identifiers in only one entry, and therefore the researcher can't get confused when adding the corresponding affiliation. Also for organizations that we support ROR in the metadata and API, and this is also present in the Affiliation Manager. So given that the Affiliation Manager also uses the ORCID API, ROR IDs can be added, and people are able to see this in the affiliation dashboard as well and check exactly their ROR ID and affiliations related to that ROR ID. So this means ROR is at the moment supported at ORCID in all part of the registry. So via the API, the Affiliation Manager, when entering affiliation manually and when searching as well. So in the advanced search, one can also enter the ROR ID and get the results. So this is more or less how this looks like if we see the user interface when an organization or when an affiliation entry, better say, is added using ROR. So the manual addition, what I was explaining before, is when we enter an employment or education or any other affiliation, we can select the organization and then only one entry is displayed per institution. And this is the one linked to ROR. So here we see how it looks like again with ROR as main identifier and then other organization identifiers provided by ROR. And in this case, FundRev, GRID, which is no longer active as Liz mentioned, ISNI, Wikidata, and others. And then in the Affiliation Manager, there is also the possibility to use ROR as the ID added, and something that we have implemented recently for the Affiliation Manager is also that notifications and emails can be sent directly from the Affiliation Manager. so that it is easier for organizations to add affiliations for their researchers, and they don't need to go to the process where they needed to merge the permission links in emails. This way, we think organizations will have more motivation to use the affiliation manager and normalize as well the affiliations on ORCID records. I've linked the data and the documentation here down below. And one example of ROR adoption using the affiliation manager is the Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology in Japan. And they used the affiliation manager in order to add, for example, in this case, an education for a PhD. And as mentioned before, we see at the beginning a ROR as organization identifier, and then other identifiers provided by ROR. And the main goal, also as Liz mentioned, is that we can have all those connections through APIs or application programming interfaces, so that the data is actually more reusable and can be enhanced and can be improved, so that we have complete or more complete, if we can say it so, data sets containing all identifiers, in this case for affiliations. And as Liz also mentioned, this can facilitate other processes like data sharing or open access. And in the case of open access, ORCID has, for example, recently begun a partnership or a cooperation with Open Access Switchboard, and the ORCID affiliation data is included in the smart matching processes from OA Switchboard. And this means that they are checking the data in the affiliation section. If no end date is found, then the Open Access Switchboard considers that affiliation a current affiliation and notifies the corresponding institution for the APC fund payment. And open access, and in this case also open access processes, are another reason for adding and keeping affiliation updated. And that will be it from my end. So many thanks. And now I think we can open the floor for questions.
So I see one in the chat that's about ROR identifiers for facilities, and I've seen this extend to different kinds of research facilities, instruments. So high throughput computing is one of the examples that's similar to this, where folks want to use a persistent identifier to track the impact of some resource that they're providing to other researchers in the literature. So the question is, if the author gives an acknowledgement using a ROR ID or maybe even another persistent identifier, will this show up within DOI metadata? The short answer to this is that they're in cross-reference metadata at the moment, and mostly in DataCite DOI metadata, there's not a structured way to express acknowledgements. There is a structured way to express citations, but not yet acknowledgements. So I know this is a thing that people are interested in. The way that I've heard people doing this so far is just basically by text mining, looking for the identifier, and oftentimes the name of the resource, but that may be something down the road for the future. I don't know if Maria or anyone else who might be familiar with cross-reference metadata knows whether structured acknowledgements are on the table.
Just a heads up, everyone should have the ability to unmute and also turn on your camera. So, so feel free to do that if you want to pipe up. Ted, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting question. Acknowledgements coming from papers and stuff, as Liz said, there's no structured way to do that. But for data sets that are collected in association with a facility, either an HPC facility or one of the things that I've been interested in lately is field stations. So people go to field stations and they do collect observations there. And in that case, the acknowledgement can be in the data set metadata with a related metadata, related identifier, I'm sorry. And in my case, I think the relation type that makes sense there is sponsor. So you do have the ability in, for instance, data site metadata to acknowledge or to make a relationship with a facility or a station using the sponsor relation type.
Great, thank you, Ted. Howard, I see you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, so this is some work that Chorus actually did with ORCID and Crossref and some publishers back in 2018 with some DOE labs in the United States. And then actually at that point, what we developed was a workflow so that the DOE labs could register the ORCID and also register themselves with an ORCID to say that use has been done at their facilities, but it never actually got into the published record. So actually, we had published a paper, and Lori Hack that actually had helped with some of that. So just this year, we've just signed a memorandum of understanding with CSIRO in Australia, which we'll be announcing very soon, which is precisely on this issue, because CSIRO wants to be able to track their facilities. So watch this space, but if any of you are interested in finding out more information about it, I put my details in the chat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. So related, so that was when ORCID added the research resources.
Correct. That's right.
Section. Paloma, do you know if that section of the ORCID record supports organization identifiers? I'm trying to remember. I think it does.
It does.
Yeah.
And therefore it also supports ROR.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep.
We don't have many of those entries, but
Correct.
They do support they do support organization identifiers.
Yeah.
And to follow up on the question, I see that Shane from Crossref posted a response in the chat for those who are interested in that they could be construed as a type of funding or sponsorship or support. I see one in the chat. This looks like for Paloma. Are there many records, affiliation, employment, education that still have Ringgold or grid identifiers from past entries, and will they be updated to use ROR behind the scenes? What's the future for those historic entries?
I think this is a very good question, particularly regarding grid identifiers. With grid identifiers, and given that the lack of publishing was pretty recent, so actually happened last week or 2 weeks ago, we are still actually seeing how we're going to do that, exactly how we are going to keep those grid URLs and if they are going to be converted into ROR. And for past Ringgold affiliations, here it depends. So when it comes to the standalone or the higher level of an institution, let's say the university, in that case there is a possibility to map them into ROR. If this is going to be if this is going to be done retrospectively or not is something that I might need to ask. The thing with Ringgold is that child institutes or departments or schools can be also represented, and for those there is no one-one match with ROR, for example, at the moment. So if an institution or a user would like to add precisely that department, we are going to still be supporting Ringgold as well.
I can add to that a little bit. So I worked previously at ORCID on the technical team. It would be very unusual for ORCID to actually change the underlying metadata that was initially submitted, but I know in talking with Tom, who's the product director, there has been some consideration around returning the mapped ROR value in the API response on output, not necessarily changing the underlying data that's in the database. But I don't know if that's actually yet on the roadmap and when that might happen.
Okay, great. Good to know. Let's see. Are there any questions in the chat that I have missed? Questions that people have that haven't been addressed yet? Ted, I see your hand up. If you would like to go ahead.
Thanks. In Liz's talk, one thing she mentioned, and it's everyone here knows that it's true, is that high quality metadata associated with an ORCID is critical for making these connections. In searching ORCID, and one of the things that I run into quite a bit is that high quality metadata is not publicly available. So I would add publicly or open high quality metadata to that sentence, because many people who have ORCIDs don't expose the metadata that goes with them. And I think if all of us that are associated with identifiers in general, sort of continue to push that importance of having that ORCID metadata be open with individuals that we're working with, I think that'd be super helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep, because if your information on your ORCID record is private, it's really not going to help anyone. I'm seeing some stuff in the chat about the DOE, Department of Energy, because they are actively using the research resources section of ORCID. So when people use DOE facilities, they're actually writing that usage to that person's ORCID record under research resources. Does anybody who's chatting about this want to unmute and speak a little bit more about that? And was the question, are they using ROR IDs in their assertions? Because when they started, ROR wasn't really available and now it is. So does anyone have that update on whether they are starting to use ROR now?
Hi, this is I'm Adam Buttrick. I'm from the curation team. I would have to check in with Carly about that. I know they are in the process of integrating ROR as all of, but I don't know that it's at a full set of completion. But their full intention to integrate ROR and use that as part of their awards DOI kind of recognition.
Yeah, want to be careful here. This is Howard. So there is a difference between the DOE itself that gives out awards and the DOE labs. So the labs are giving out awards, if you will, for the purpose of the usage of, say, their hadron colliders or whatever that they may be giving use for. So that is different from the DOE giving away, say, a grant for money. However, the Office of Scientific and Technical Information, which Carly is involved with, does know about these things, so that's important. But as I said, I'll actually find the reference to the paper that Lori and I had published many years ago, and I will put it into the chat.
Great, thank you. And thanks, Paloma, for the example ORCID records where people can go in and see what that looks like, that research resources entry on these ORCID records here. All right, any other comments, questions? Okay, so earlier on, there were a few questions just in case anyone else kind of missed these. One, there was a question of whether a university press or a library press would be eligible for a ROR ID. And the answer to that was put in the chat, and the answer was yes. University presses are well represented in ROR, not as sure about library presses, but it's certainly possible to get a ROR ID.
I'll just mention too, this is Amanda French. I'm the brand new technical community manager for ROR. And the ROR ID I linked to is for NYU Press, which at one point was sort of, you know, had a library connection. I think it was sort of jointly managed by both the library and the press. But I don't know of any sort of standalone library presses that are represented in ROR, but, you know, I don't know all of the 100,000 records, so there could be some.
Yeah, hi, this is Adam Buttrick, the metadata curation lead again. So with library presses, normally we have a requirement that there's publishing beyond the scope of, vanity publishing isn't the correct term, but publishing beyond the scope of essentially printing things for individual researchers at the university. So, you know, some library and university presses are essentially integrated, some exist separately. So essentially we're looking for some degree of independence as a publisher, and that can get simple as, you know, contributing to various open access platforms or journal platforms. So that's the distinction. University presses tend to be more in scope because of their integration in existing scholarly comp systems.
Okay, great. Thanks, Amanda and Adam, and thank you, Liz, for linking to the ROR inclusion criteria. So that will be helpful in determining what organizations can have a ROR.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I also dropped in a full metadata policy
yeah,
for anyone who really wants some exciting reading.
Awesome. There was another question earlier on if we had a list of publishers or journals that were using ROR. I know, Amanda, you had answered this in the chat, but do you want to just speak to that a little bit? I think the gist was, you know, ROR is still a relatively new identifier, so we're probably not necessarily going to see as many ROR IDs in publication DOI metadata right now, but as time goes on, we should be seeing more. Can you elaborate, Amanda, please?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are many publishers in particular and journals who have indicated that they would like to adopt ROR for sure. And I think, and that question was also asked in the context of crossref metadata in particular. And I think, you know, not everybody who has adopted ROR is necessarily registering DOIs with crossref. So as Liz mentioned, because crossref only recently, like, you know, maybe, I don't know, 6-8 months ago, started supporting ROR, that's one reason why there aren't as many in there. DataCite also has plenty of RORs. I don't know what the actual figure is for DataCite offhand, but as I mentioned, the number of, you know, the number of ROR IDs in crossref metadata is very low. It's only about 10,000, but it was 4,000 in February. So it's increasing quite a bit. And of course, it's still going to take an even larger rate of increase for it to, you know, make any kind of dent in the 135 million DOIs that crossref is currently providing. But yeah, Liz, you know offhand, RORs in DataCite?
Last time I checked, it was about 3 or 4%. It was about 6 months ago. And similarly, support for affiliation identifiers of any sort, ROR or otherwise, was only added to DataCite metadata in 2019. And for crossref, it's not just ROR support, but structured affiliation metadata support was just added 6 or 8 months ago. So it's kind of not a question of whether there are RORs or not, but whether there's any structured affiliation metadata, which is a very small number for both sets right now, but increasingly more as we get more service providers and vendors updating to the latest schemas for both DOI providers.
And Sean, you're really right to mention in the chat that there are a lot of sort of meta projects that are really happy that ROR exists now, including OpenAlex and OA Switchboard. So they're not journals, they're not publishers, but they are heavy users of ROR IDs for sure.
Yeah, I want to back.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
If I could just go back on something that Liz just said, I totally agree. So we've done a straw poll of our publishers, Chorus, that are our Chorus members, and which are a lot of the big guys, and as well as the society publishers, and pretty much to a T, they've all said Q4 this year or beginning of next year. But the real key actually is not the willingness on the part of the publishers; it's actually their platforms. Mm-hmm. So I mean, if there's pressure to be applied, it's got to be applied to the Adapons, the Silverchairs, the MPS systems. Those are the guys that hold the keys. Then it's up to the publishers to decide to use those functions. Exactly,
and that's part of Amanda's new remit, and she's based at Crossref, which
great
has strong relationships with.
There you go, Amanda.
with a lot of these vendors.
Yeah, no, and yeah, you're more right than you know. I've said on a couple of occasions, in a way, some publishers, especially the sort of middle range publishers, don't need to choose to adopt ROR because whatever system they're already using will, we hope, just bake it in. So yeah, that's definitely part of my remit for the next little while.
Yeah, I mean, there's two parts to that. There's the part that they don't have to choose to do it, but they also need to make sure that their management tracking systems are accepting as many authors as possible. Because a lot of times it's only the contributing author, which, as we all know, does not quite work especially well for like physics papers, which have like hundreds of authors. So they're going to be doing a much better job.
Wonderful, great points. Go ahead, Adam.
Yeah, so I just wanted to add, outside of our list of integrations, we also know that we have some large publishers, which I haven't looked at the list of integrations in the past week or so, like Wiley and Cambridge University Press that are in the process of kind of switching over from Grid to ROR. But obviously with the scale of their platforms, that's a bigger endeavor than, kind of smaller scale, kind of open access integration. So I just wanted to put that out there, only specifically because we were working with Cambridge University Press last week in response to some UI changes that we made.
Yeah, and similar to your question about ORCID profiles, Jen, I mean, we think a lot of the people who are adopting ROR, especially, if it's publishers, they'll begin contributing ROR to Crossref going forward. But that doesn't mean they're necessarily going to backfill all of the DOIs that they've already submitted. So we'll have to see how that works. But I think at least in terms of new content, we're expecting quite a bit of uptake.
Amanda just said the magic word that people have mentioned earlier, but backfill. Backfill is really important, particularly as Howard mentioned for non-corresponding authors. And there are things that repositories can do. I'm a big fan of activist repositories who help submitters improve their metadata by adding identifiers. So those projects are, Howard doesn't think that'll happen, but actually there's a lot of cases where it's not as hard as we think, because you can make a lot of ground with only a few identifiers in most of these, at least data site repositories.
To add on to Ted's point, we do index external IDs from Wikidata, ISNI, and other sources, which can be used to backfill if that data is indexed in existing records. So it's not impossible to crosswalk back things using those identifiers as well.
I guess along the same line, because this question has come up from members of our ORCID US community. So for ORCID records where the individual has added their own affiliation, so like their own employment, and when they added it in the past, ROR did not exist, so maybe it has the Ringgold ID or the Grid ID. We touched on this a little bit earlier, Paloma, but when an individual has added those themselves, does the individual now need to go back and like redo those if they want the ROR ID to appear on that affiliation? Or what is the kind of recommendation from ORCID in terms of those, you know, affiliations that had been added manually in the past that don't have a ROR ID on them right now?
Yes, so as mentioned, I am unsure about what is going to happen with grid, as of course, if we can't redirect grid URLs, we might need to update those. But also, as Liz mentioned, it is quite unlikely that we are going to change past affiliations. So if this happens in the future, there will be definitely guidelines in order to do so.
Can I want to contribute a personal experience here. When I was job hunting, before I got this new wonderful position as ROR Technical Community Manager, I went in to update my ORCID profile and noticed that I was being prompted to update my past employers, basically. And being the clean data nerd that I am, I was really thrilled because I could tell that it was, you know, converting from what I had such an early ORCID record, I'm not even sure, you know, they had grid identifiers, but at any rate, I happily went in and opted using the type ahead widget to add standardized organizations to my ORCID profile. And so now on my ORCID profile, you can see ROR IDs because I went in and did that, and it was very easy. So in terms of will people do that, or will ORCID, you know, encourage them to do that? I don't know. But as somebody who happened to go in and update my ORCID profile anyway for different reasons, it was a terrific experience. So.
Okay, great. Are there any last minute questions? We have about 5 minutes left. Does anybody have kind of a burning question related to ORCID and ROR that you would like to ask in these last 5 minutes? Well, if anybody does think of questions, feel free to send us an email, orcidus@lyrasis.org. It's in the chat there, and we will facilitate getting your questions answered. I do want to give a big thank you to our guest speakers, Liz and Paloma, today. Thank you so much. And then also everyone else who attended the call today, speaking from all these different perspectives. I think it's been really great to hear from everyone. So hopefully this call has been helpful. Again, if you have any questions, email us. We will be sending out the recording and the slides. I've got notes and the Q&A all typed up too, so stay tuned for that. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your week. Thank you so much, everyone. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Sheila.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.